Hi, my name is Sean McIntosh. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar on Azure licensing. We find there's a great deal of confusion in the market around this offering. Our presentation today will delve into the ins and outs of how to license Azure, and our speaker today, as usual, is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team here at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated over $1 billion in Microsoft contracts over his career. He spent almost a decade working at Microsoft in licensing-related roles and has extensive experience with best practices to help reduce software licensing costs. Just some housekeeping, the lines will be muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation unless Mike can get to them during the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. We are recording this presentation. It will be made available for encore viewing at method180.com. We will also send out the PowerPoint deck and the recording links to you within a few days after the conclusion of the webinar. I'm just going to turn things over to Mike to get the presentation started.
Great, thanks, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody, or I guess good morning, depending on whereabouts you are. So I'll keep the commercial about who Method 180 is, but I've noticed that there's a number of people that are first time to one of our webinars. So just at a high level, Method 180 is a small consulting organization that focuses on driving costs out of vendor contracts. We focus primarily on Microsoft, although we have expanded our portfolio to a few others like Oracle and IBM and SAP this year. But we focus really a lot around doing one of kind of three things, whether those be contract or enterprise agreement negotiations and looking at how to structure those to drive out cost, whether it's an audit assistance if you're in an audit or a SAM engagement with Microsoft or one of those other vendors and need some help defending your position or, getting rid of some of the ridiculous audit findings, I guess. And then we also have a couple other things where we would do self-assessments for organizations looking to understand what their license position is. We work with some of our customers on retainer type relationships where we're around to help answer questions as they're looking at rolling things out and how those relate to their licensing and things like that. So enough with the commercial. We're here today to talk about Azure and licensing within Azure. And so I think the first thing, I really want to get across is Azure is a bit of a new paradigm in the Microsoft world. It really is not about licensing, okay? So when we talk about Azure, we're not talking about licensing like we traditionally think of purchasing, an Office license and installing that on a desktop, or even purchasing an Office 365 license and kind of assigning that to a user. It's not about licensing. There are some components of licensing to deal with Azure, and we're going to talk about that. But with Azure, what we're really looking at is consumption of services. So in other words, you're purchasing compute power, you're purchasing storage, you're purchasing bandwidth, you're purchasing data transfer. It's about consuming services and paying for those services much more so than it is about licensing. And so, licensing or asset management within the Azure world isn't about, do I have 1,000 deployed? I need to purchase 1,000. It's more about watching what you're buying. So what do I mean by that? How big of a VM am I buying? Do I really need 8 cores or do I need 4? Do I really need a terabyte of storage or is 500 gigabytes enough? So it's really about watching what you're buying. It's about watching how long you need those things running within Azure, because Azure is a pay by the hour type service. So, do I really need that VM to be running 24 hours by 7 days a week? Or could we run it, 7 to 7 and save, 12 hours a day type thing? So it's really about watching what you're using and how long it's running. It's about making sure that the services that you're paying for that have been turned on are actually being consumed. I'm going to talk about that a little later this afternoon. And it's about turning things off when they aren't needed. And that's how you drive cost out on Azure. So it's really not about how many did I buy? Did I buy enough? Did I deploy too many? When we traditionally think about, software licensing or asset management, it's really about what do I have running? Do I need that to be running? Is it the right size? Is it the right things? And there are some licensing things that come with it inherent in what we have with our on-premise stuff. And again, I'm going to touch on that here in a little bit. So there's really kind of three ways that you can purchase Azure. Most of our clients, being enterprise type customers, are probably in the bottom one here, but there really are 3 ways to purchase this. And we do see all 3 of these in, some of our biggest clients. The first is pay-as-you-go, basically pay rack rate, in the Azure portal, punch in your credit card number and buy a server. That's kind of the pay-as-you-go model. Microsoft is putting a lot of emphasis around cloud service providers, or CSPs. And so those are, third-party organizations. It could be resellers. It could be places like DataPipe or Rackspace that are service providers of Microsoft. They may offer some value over and above sort of you deploying it yourself. A lot of them have management and monitoring tools and things like that they may offer. They also, once you get into the CSP thing, you can start to actually get into some discounts over the rack rates in the portal. And again, I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail here in a minute. And then in volume licensing, it's really this thing called Azure Monetary Commit. Though you can buy individual Azure services. Again, we'll talk about that. But it's about Azure Monetary Commit. And in that case, the more you commit, the more savings you get on the services themselves. So the key thing here is that there is some flexibility. It's kind of pay-as-you-go, credit card. Anybody off the street, us here at Method 180 and our 12 or 13 employees, we could get a server and just pay for that. As you move into some of these other programs where you commit and use some of your volume license or volume, you can actually get some discounts, not in this traditional way that we think about discounts. And again, I'm gonna talk about that. Okay. So the first thing I'm really going to talk about is Azure Monetary Commit, because the pay-as-you-go really is just log into the portal. And we're actually going to log into the calculator a little bit later here this afternoon. But you really just log into the portal, configure something, put in your credit card, and start paying for it. But the way that we see probably 95% of our client base and sort of the corporate account base purchase is this thing called Azure Monetary Commitment. Now, the first thing I always tell people is think of it like a bank account, because what ends up happening is I commit to $100,000 of Azure in a year. That goes onto my CPS. It sits in the bank. And then as I use Azure services, so it's, an IT person goes in to the portal, spins up a VM, starts using services that are chargeable on a monthly basis, that sort of deducts from my $100,000. Okay, so it really is a bank account. Now, one of the things that's an important concept, and this is where some of our clients have been struggling, is Azure Monetary Commit is not really a discountable item. Okay, so what'll happen is a lot of times organizations will say, well, I want to do $100,000 Azure Commit. Microsoft, you gave me a 10% discount on everything else in my EA, so I should only pay $90,000. It's not the way that it works, because it really is just a commitment. I'm creating that bank account. Where you receive discount through Azure Monetary Commit is within the portal itself. So in other words, if a VM was 6 cents an hour, and depending on my size, because depending on how big you are, if I'm a level A EA customer versus a level D, there's slightly different discount rates that actually start to happen just as I commit to this Azure Monetary Commit within the portal. So you really don't see it, right? So how do I measure if I'm trying to show that we're getting savings in the organization? How do I measure that? A little bit difficult, because just moving into this, giving the Azure Monetary Commit, you got to go into the portal and look at the price before, the price after, and what are you getting. But basically what happens is once I commit to this Azure Monetary Commit, Microsoft automatically sets up in the portal a rate based on my level in the EA, and the unit price that you see in the portal itself gets discounted. Okay, so that's a little bit different. I don't see these prices on a CPS. We'll talk about that in a little bit later, but for the most part, 95% of the time you're not going to. You're just going to see this one line item, Azure Monetary Commit, and in the portal, based on my volume, my discount goes down. Okay. The other thing that we are seeing is that Microsoft is increasing the discounts that depending on how much you commit to Azure. So for instance, if you commit to 500,000 or $1 million a year or $1.6 million, you may start to see discounts on the individual services somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on that commitment. So if I commit through Azure Monetary Commitment, they'll actually start to potentially give you bigger discounts. Now, that is something you need to negotiate with them. That doesn't happen automatically, okay? The automatic thing is just I'm an EA customer, I get a little bit of a discount. If you want a deeper discount, you need to negotiate that with them based on the size of your commitment. Now, the one thing that Microsoft has done, and this is relatively new, is that Azure monetary commitments on an enterprise agreement are committed each year, right? So if I sign an EA, it's $100,000 in year one, $100,000 in year two, $100,000 in year three. It's a use it or lose it during the year. Okay, it used to be over the 3-year term. Now it's just the year. Okay, so you have to, if you commit to something in the year, you need to use it in the year or you're going to lose it. Okay, now they made that change when they made some other changes we're going to talk about here in a second, where they used to have monetary penalties if you went over what you committed to. So if I committed to 100,000, ended up using 150,000, they were charging higher rates and charging you penalties for going over your commitments. They removed the penalties, but took away the ability to carry the Azure monetary commit across the 3 years of the EA. So I guess Microsoft give and Microsoft take in that case. One of the things that we're telling our clients and that we're seeing is if you're a current Azure client and you have some history and you know that you're using a number of services, and I'll talk about what these things look like, but let's just say you know that you have 3 A1 VMs that you're using, you can actually put an A1 VM on the CPS and negotiate a rate on the CPS, which may be better than the rates that you're getting in the portal and may be better than the rates that you're getting for these commitments of just money in the bank. And so once you start to get history, you really want to start to look at your consumption and your usage to see what you're doing, to see if I want to actually put that part number on. Now, there's a little bit of a challenge in doing that, or a trick, so to speak, is that in the portal, I pay basically per the hour. If I put that A1 instance on my CPS, I pay for it for the whole month. So you're going to have to look at some benefits, and that's a thing with Azure about the cost of it is it's almost you have to look at workload by workload and figure out what's the best way to be doing these things based on how long it needs to be on, what it is, and things like that. Again, I'm gonna dive into this. I'm gonna try and give you some high level concepts here, and then we'll dive in. The key thing is that what most enterprises are doing is this Azure monetary commitment, where they're committing to just $1 that sort of goes into a bank account, and that bank account gets deducted from as you actually consume services within the Azure portal itself. Okay. So I talked a little bit about this. So, but there's another concept that I just want to make sure is understood. This is not a deal breaker with a lot of people, but it's just something that I want to make sure that you understand. Is Microsoft has this concept around Azure consumption allowance. And so what that is, as I said earlier, Microsoft used to charge penalties for going over your monetary commit. So if I committed to 100,000 but spent 150,000, on the 50,000, the unit price that I was paying for the service itself was increased with a penalty. They removed the penalty and came up with a consumption allowance, which basically works as follows. The consumption allowance is 50% of your monetary commitment. So in the example that we've been using here, I'm committing to 100,000. The consumption allowance is 50,000. So if my annual usage is less than 150, the commitment plus the consumption allowance, any overages will be billed like a true up at the end of the year. Okay. So in other words, if I use over 100,000 but less than 150,000, so let's say I use 130,000, the 30,000 will be invoiced as a true up at the end of the year on my anniversary date. If I go over by greater than the consumption allowance, so again with this customer, if they go over 150,000, so let's say they go to 200,000, once you get to over 150, the overages will begin to be billed on a quarterly basis. Okay, so again, not a big issue, but just I had a client the other day got a bill on a quarterly basis. They couldn't figure out why, and it really was they started out really small. I think they started with about 100,000, but they grew their consumption to about $300,000 within 6 months, and they started getting these quarterly bills, and they weren't sure why. And this is why I think it's just Microsoft's way of making sure that clients don't get these great big bills at the end of the year that they're not expecting, but they do have this consumption allowance where if I do an Azure monetary commit, as long as I don't go greater than 50% over that commitment, I just pay for it as a true up. If I do go greater than 50%, they're going to bill me on a quarterly basis for that overage, okay? Now, I tell people your friend is the pricing calculator. The URL that it's located at here is here. If you just Google Azure pricing calculator, it will show up. Now, a couple of things just to note, and I am going to be opening the calculator, and we're going to go through and just kind of show you how to play around in here in a little bit. But these are pay-as-you-go rates, so they're not your unique rates, but it's a good way just to start to look at the impacts of a few things. The tool itself defaults to 100 hours of usage per month, which, depending on what you're doing, that might be a silly number. You might need to be looking at 24/7 times 30 days, whatever that math works out to be. So just note that it defaults to 100 hours of usage in a month. And the way that you actually get billed is based on how many hours you use in a month. So I had a client that's like, okay, this server is going to cost me $6 a month. And then they got their first bill, and it was something like $100 a month. And it was because they used the calculator that was at 6 hours, and they had it at 100 hours, and they had it turned on for 24 hours a day for a whole month. So just a quick little note on the pricing calculator there. Okay. So really, what happens, a lot of what we're hearing a lot of things around are really two things. I'm going to take a Windows workload, I'm going to take a SQL workload, I'm going to move it to Azure. What do we need to consider? And this is where I was saying that the service itself is not licensing, but there are some licensing things to consider, okay? And so here are those things that you want to consider from a licensing perspective, okay? First, with Windows Server, it does not have cloud mobility. So it needs to be licensed in Azure. The Windows Server SA does not include cloud mobility. Now, they do have this thing that they call the Azure hybrid use benefit that comes with SA. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So if I do have SA, I could potentially take my Windows license. We're going to talk about when and where that makes sense when we start to look at some numbers here. Okay. Now, the one thing to note is if you are going to use the AHUB, the Azure hybrid use benefit, you have a different install process. And if you just Google it, you'll find it, so that when your IT people are setting up the Azure instance within the portal itself, they do not want to select Windows, because if they do that, then it's going to charge them for the Windows license if you want to use the AHUB thing. Another thing that we get asked quite often is, do we need to have client access licenses or CALs covered with software assurance? Is there any requirements there? The answer is no. The CALs are not required to access Windows servers in Azure, because those are covered within the per minute charge of the virtual machines themselves. So you don't have to pay for Windows Server CALs, or you don't have to have SA on there. Now, the product that a lot of people are using to do monitoring with System Center of their Windows Server environments does have server mobility rights. So if I want to monitor my Windows instances in Azure or patch or do whatever I want to do with System Center suite of products, as long as I have software assurance, those have server mobility rights, which allow me to use those to cover instances in the cloud. The trick here is just that standard can cover 2 VMs, data center can manage 8. Okay, so data center is not unlimited like on-prem, standard 2, data center 8. So if you are using it, you're just going to take a look at the number of VMs that you have up there and figure out the appropriate amount of SA that you need from a System Center perspective there. Okay, so let's talk about purchasing Windows VMs within Azure. So the first thing to note is that each region, think of it as a data center, has a different pricing structure. So there are a number of data centers across the US. There's data centers in Europe and Asia. The first thing you do is you pick the data center that you want that VM to reside in. Each region has a different price. So sometimes, depending on where you're at and latency and things like that, there may be some advantage to picking an east, maybe the data center east over the west data center from a pricing perspective. The next thing that you do when you're purchasing a Windows VM is you're going to look at purchasing an instance size. And you're going to see things like A1 to A11 or A1 version 2 to A8 version 2 and D1 to D64 and NC instances and VN instances. And what is all of that? Okay, what it really boils down to is the following. The higher you go from A to NV, the more power you're buying. Cores, RAM, storage, latency, all that sort of stuff. So the more compute you're purchasing. So an A1 might be 1 core, and A8 may be 8 cores. And I'll show you how this works. The V2 is just that they're using newer server technology. So those, obviously have a little bit higher cost. Eventually, the A1 to 11 will probably disappear, and there'll be a V3 because you do see that in the D instances. So that's just some of the server technology itself. But really what you're doing when you're purchasing a Windows VM is you're purchasing cores, you're purchasing RAM, and you're purchasing storage. And so you need to go in, you need to look at your requirements, purchase the appropriate AD whatever plan, and you provision that. Now, if you are using the Azure Home Use Benefit, what you want to do is use the type as Linux to remove the cost of Windows. So I'm just going to jump into the Azure pricing tool just real quick. We're going to come back and do a pricing model, but I just want to show you what I just talked about. So if you look here, this is the Azure pricing tool. If you just to get an idea, you can see I can pick whichever data center I want it in. It defaults to the east, I believe, but I can just pick central. I can pick the operating system. So if I want to pay for Windows, I pick Windows. If I want to get the price without Windows, I just pick Linux. Do not pick SUSE Linux or Umbato because those actually have a charge. The Linux one is the one that you want to do if using the Azure Home Use Benefit. Okay. Then what I was talking about in terms of the size, again, I'm just going to click this just to sort of show you. We're going to talk about this and look at how you look at this stuff. But just you can see as I go up from A1, it's 1 core, 0.7 gigabytes of RAM, 20 gigabytes of disk. It's 2 cents per hour. And as I go up the stack, obviously I get more cores, more RAM, more disk, and it costs more. Okay. So that's what I mean is it's no longer about what license it is. It's about what do I need? And one of the traps that I had a client that early on got stuck in was they looked at it and just kind of said, oh, we're an enterprise, and they sort of scrolled all the way down to the bottom and just picked these guys, and we're paying really expensive rates for stuff that they didn't just because they assumed they were an enterprise customer. They should pick the biggest size. Okay, so I think that's one of the key things there is you want to make sure that the sizing is done correctly. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But again, like I said, you can see it defaults to 100 hours, so you can change that to days to months. But that's just what you're looking at. So when I'm talking about Windows servers, those are the things that we're looking at is again number of cores, amount of RAM, and disk space that you're paying for that VM to be on there. Okay. So when it comes to SQL Server, what are we considering with SQL? SQL is actually a little bit more complicated than Windows. Windows is pretty straightforward. If I just got a Windows workload, I'm going to look at cores. I'm going to look at how much RAM I need, and I'm going to look at storage and kind of pick the most appropriate one. SQL is a little bit more complicated. So with SQL, you can pay by the hour or the minute in the portal. You can pay by the month if I put the part number on the EA. Or you can use your server mobility rights of SQL Server because SQL Server has that and use that in the cloud. So SQL, I can take my own license, to the cloud. Again, you're going to want to take a look at the cost associated with the SA and the cost associated with purchasing SQL within the cloud itself to figure out if that makes sense. There are instances where it does make sense, and there's definitely instances where it doesn't make sense. We're going to look at that even with Windows here in a little bit. But a couple of things to note: if I do have a server cal model, the cals need to have SA2. Okay. Again, with SQL, the 4-core minimum applies. So if I pick a VM that is 4 cores or less, I can use, I just need 4 core licenses. if my VM has 8, I need to make sure I have 8 cores of licenses assigned to that Azure instance, okay? So if you're going to take your own licenses, you can just basically install a SQL image on your Windows VM utilizing the SA benefit. There is a paperwork requirement that needs to be filled out within 10 days that can be found at microsoftvolumelicensing.com. You just look for licensing document search and then locate the licensing verification form. Really what that form is you certifying that you actually have the SA and that you're assigning it to that server. But you do need to fill that paperwork out. Another little thing when it comes to licensing SQL Server itself, active passive configurations require licenses on both sides, whereas we know passive is potentially free on the on-premise piece. So little, gotcha there. Okay, and I did put in here, I'm not going to go into this because a lot of this Azure stuff about how you actually deploy it and how you do this is actually somewhat technical, right? And so what I mean by that is if I'm going to bring my own license for SQL, you can pick a VM in the Azure gallery that's labeled BYOL and use the SQL image in the Azure marketplace, and then that won't charge you for it. Or you can install SQL from an image that you've created and then upload that into your VM and utilize it. So it is kind of technical, and you need to make sure that you do this properly, right? So for instance, I know we're talking about SQL right now. We had a client that wanted to take advantage of the Azure home use, Azure hybrid use benefit. They were able to do it, but they'd originally set up the image with a Windows license. And it was almost like a migration that they had to do in order to change that to being a hub used server. Like they basically really had to re-image the server in order to do it, because it's technically how you set it up, how the portal is going to work. It's not really like server licensing where I sort of I sometimes joke that when I'm applying a Windows Server license to a server, I walk into the server room and go, I give you a Windows Server, and kind of point at a server and walk away, right? It's not quite like that. The technical requirements are different, and so if you make a mistake when setting it up, it potentially could cause some problems where you actually have to go back and uninstall or do almost like a migration to fix those issues, right? So that you're not paying for those licenses within Azure itself. So again, when you're purchasing SQL VMs, the licensing cost, if I'm not using BYOL, is baked into the cost of the service itself. Okay. But with SQL, unlike Windows where you're buying kind of cores and RAM and storage, which is concepts that are fairly easy to understand, SQL gets complicated in that Microsoft sells SQL based on database transaction units, or DTUs. Okay, and DTUs are really just the amount of resources that Microsoft guarantees to that database, regardless of however many other databases are within Azure. So they're going to assign resources to it, and basically what they mean by that is CPU, memory, and I/O, and that includes I/O for data and transaction logs. And so there's a whole fancy formula that goes into determining DTU on a SQL database. I think if you're technical, you may actually know what this is, because it's not a Microsoft thing, but they sell it based on the DTU, and it is about as clear as mud, right? So if I've got a SQL database that I want to migrate over into Azure, how many DTUs do I need, right? Like that, if I'm trying to figure that out, it's probably not straightforward. There's no calculation you can sort of automatically do, but as with everything, Microsoft does offer a free tool. I've put the link here where you can run this query against the database itself, and it'll tell you how many DTUs are required. Okay. The other kind of catch with SQL from a licensing perspective is that, or not even licensing, this one's more cost perspective, service that you're consuming, is you can kind of purchase single databases, or you can purchase elastic database pools, which are much more expensive. But elastic databases are set there to help you manage varying requirements around DTUs, right? So an example that I can use is that, maybe I'm moving my payroll system, maybe not the best example. I'm moving my SAP system to Azure, and at the end of the quarter, the amount of compute that we need for the SQL databases really goes up, then DTUs go way up. But the rest of the quarter, when we're not running quarter-end reports or year-end reports, it's a lot less. You may want Elastic because it sort of scales and slides up and down based on requirements. But if you don't need it, it actually increases the cost quite substantially. So again, I'm just going to flip back over into our pricing tool and look at a SQL just to kind of show you how this works, right? So again, if you look, SQL doesn't have as many options. You're just buying DTUs, right? It gives you a little bit more storage if you get up into some of the really big systems, but for the most part, you're just buying power here, okay? So you want to size your database correctly. And if we look here, this is 62.5 cents per hour. If I do an Elastic database, you're going to see that it changes, right? It's going to be Elastic DTUs. So it was 125. I bet you they don't have 125 for us easily to compare to, right? So again, what I can tell you is these get much more expensive as you start assigning them to Elastic, Elastic DP or Elastic databases. But again, it's the same sort of thing as DTUs. How many do we need? How many do we think we need to stretch to based on a pool of databases versus just call it a single instance of a database? Okay. So if I'm moving a SQL workload, I'm going to pay for cores, I'm going to pay for RAM, I'm going to pay for storage. If it has a SQL database on there, I'm going to pay for DTUs. The amount that I pay for that RAM, core, and storage could be higher or lower depending on if I use the Azure home use or hybrid use benefit. SQL DTUs are going to depend on if I'm using the SQL licenses, so the price may be slightly higher or slightly lower. Again, I'm going to show you this here in a second based on what I'm doing there. But Microsoft charges for other things. Some of it is relatively small. For instance, if you want a static IP address, it's fairly cheap. But some of it can get costly, okay? So for instance, data into Azure is typically free. Data out of Azure is not. So if I'm running a website or a web app and users are pulling data out of Azure, if they're in a different zone, so if they're in the east, let's say we have that application in the east data center, and they're over on the west coast. If they're pulling data out, there's a data transfer charge there. If you want to leave Azure and pull that back into on-premise or move it to AWS or some other provider, you're going to pay for the charges to pull your data back out. And so they have their published rates for these things. I didn't put them in here, but they do have published rates for these data charges. The other one that people get charged for data on is if you have a disaster recovery requirement and you're moving that back on-premise, so you're doing the DR to an on-premise thing, you're going to end up with data charges. So they do charge for data going out. They don't charge for it going in. Very rare exceptions where they do, but coming out, you're definitely going to pay for it. You pay for bandwidth, and obviously storage is paid. And there's different types of storage. You're going to have standard storage, which is just kind of hard disk. You got premium storage with SSD. You can have unmanaged disk where your administrator manually manages the storage. You could have a managed disk where it's stored in a single storage account. So there's different storage types that you have. You definitely want to make sure that you're purchasing the correct storage here. We had one client where we looked at their Azure consumption, and 60% of it was based on blob storage. They had no clue what blob storage was, and the application itself didn't need it. It was just the administrator that set it up picked the most expensive option. Again, they went into the portal, selected a bunch of stuff, and just went, oh, well, we're a big company. We must need that one. It's more expensive. And they were paying 60% of their Azure commit on blob storage when it should have been less than 10%. So you really, again, just an example of some of the other things that they charge you for. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Azure hybrid use benefit, which I keep calling home use benefit, but anyways, Azure hybrid use benefit, it basically allows you to use your Windows servers if they have SA to offset the cost of Windows Server licensing in Azure. Now, Microsoft will tell you that it's about 40% cheaper than if you use your own licenses than if you buy it from them. That is true, but it actually, when you factor in the cost of SA, it may not be true. The way that they do that is you look at the price of a Windows server versus the price of a Linux server. We talked about that real briefly. We're going to actually pull this up and kind of show you through this here in a second. There's different rules for data center and standard licenses than the on-premise. Standard can only be used in standard can only be used to, if you're going to assign a standard license to an Azure instance, it can only be used in the Azure instance, whereas data center you can use on both an on-premise deployment and an Azure deployment. Okay, the 90-day rule still applies. If I sign it to Azure, I can't move it for 90 days, so they don't take that back. But the main difference here is that basically you have to license 16 core minimums or 2 processors if you still have processor licenses. And with SA on a standard, you get 1 VM of 16, or if you've got VMs that are 8 or less, you can have 2, right? So basically, for every standard license, 16 cores has to be assigned, and as long as those VMs are consuming less than 8 cores each, you can use 16 cores to 2 licenses. Okay, so let's make sure that's clear because it's kind of confusing. I have to assign at least 16 cores. If I have 2 VMs in Azure that are 8 cores or less, I can cover 2 with those 16 cores of standard. If they are greater than 8 cores, I can only cover 1. If I happen to have a 24-core VM in Azure, I need to assign 24 cores to cover that, okay? With data center, it's not unlimited like on-premise. You actually only can to cover 2 VMs in the Azure cloud with your data center license. Okay, so they don't allow you to cover unlimited. It's 2, but I get to use it on-premise and in the cloud. So think of it this way. Let's just make it simple. I'm a small organization. I have one host server that we have 16 cores of data center in. It's got 10 VMs on it. That's fine. I've licensed 16 cores. I go and put 2 VMs in Azure. I can use those 16 cores of data center to cover those 2 as long as they're 8 cores or less, and still use it on premise. With standard, I couldn't do that because it has to be in one or the other, but data center allows me to do that. And there doesn't have to really be any correlation from what I can tell to the VMs that are on my on-premise to the hybrid. They just or to the Azure cloud. They just let you sort of assign those as you see fit, okay? Now, what I want to do is show you how this actually breaks down. This is not a great spreadsheet by any stretch of the imagination, but just I wanted to show people how this works. So I'm going to just go down to a Windows server here. We'll leave it in. We're going to leave it in the US Central. Basically, if you look here, this is charged at 2 cents per hour. It's an A1, it's 1 core. So I'm just going to put an A0, it's 1 core, it's 0.02 cents an hour. We're going to assume that it is used 24/7 by 30 days, so just assume 30 days in a month. And so I would just be looking at this. If I look at this, my cost is $100 a month for that. Now, if I'm using a hub, I'm sorry, I got to put that in the wrong spot. If I'm using my A hub benefit, what I do here is I'm just going to change this from Windows to Linux. Did the price stay the same? It shouldn't have. Well, that's interesting. On that one, it's staying the same. I'm wondering if there's a. Okay, we're going to use this. So it's 1 core. it was 9 cents an hour. So it's an A1. It's 9 cents an hour. On the A hub, it was 6 cents. Again, we're going to do the 30 times 7 times 24. Now, if I look at this from a cost of the year, I'm just going to quickly say this is my cost per month here. And if I'm going to do a hub, it's definitely going to be it's this times this plus the standard, and I need at least eight cores. So if I look at it, I've done something incorrect here. It's this times this. So if I look at this instance here, if I'm going to assign a standard license to this server, if I buy Windows in Azure, it's actually cheaper to do than if I use my SA. Now, if we get into some of the bigger servers, this is where the costs all change, right? So if I'm going to take this one here, it's 8 cores. For Linux, it's 40 cents an hour. And for Windows, it's 60 cents an hour. This is 50/40. So again, if I look at this one, I'm just going to say if I use the standard licenses for this, what am I looking at? And I need 8 standards. So you can see that in that case, it's cheaper to bring my own license, right? So the bigger you go, the more you're actually going to save here. So these calculations get quite complex. That's why I say you need to look at it and say, okay, how am I going to, what am I going to be using? What size am I using? How often am I going to be using it? Because if we took and said that this was half, so let's just say it's 2,500 hours a month, you know, the value proposition on all of this changes, right? So you have to take a look and go, what makes sense, right? Does it make sense, you know, based on how long we're turning that on, how long we're turning it off? Because if that server doesn't need to be on 24/7, you know, we're going to cut the cost in half by shutting it off, and you can automate that and things like that. So that is sort of just at a high level how we would start to look at it. Like I said, this is a pretty simple scenario, but we wanted to kind of show people here's how we start to look at these things when we're looking at, you know, what makes the most sense. So I think, Sean, I think that's all I have for today. I don't know if there were any questions or not. I haven't taken my eye out to take a look at the questions.
We don't have any questions yet, but I have one of my own, but I'm just going to encourage folks, if there's people who have questions that they're thinking about right now, noodling on, please feel free to submit them. We'll do our best to answer them. But I guess, Mike, one thing I'm wondering is in a corporation where they've got they've negotiated an enterprise agreement, but yet, you know, through the course of time, some people have inevitably done what they shouldn't do and gone out and done some credit card transactions. Is there any mechanism to kind of consolidate that Azure at some point, or is that really a renewal scenario?
So the short answer is yes. I mean, it's a little bit of a process to transfer them off of the credit card onto the corporate ones to get the better rates, but you can definitely do it. You just have to work through the policy, like work through the process to do it, but you can definitely do it.
Okay, and I see we've got a question now. It's a question about enterprise dev test as a cost-saving strategy for MSDN usage in Azure. Have you done that analysis?
Yes, we've done that. It does work out to hey Dave, it does work out to saving you. It does definitely work out to saving you money. But again, it's almost like scenario by scenario. Like even like I said, like I know I was showing a real simple scenario, but if you look at that A0 instance and using the A hub, it doesn't make sense. Now, if you have access licenses, obviously it makes sense. But you know, if you look at it just from pure cost perspective, that in that case it doesn't make sense. So with a dev test strategy, you know, can you save money? Absolutely. There's definitely money savings that are potentially there on licensing, and obviously cost of having servers on premise and things like that. So we have done it. What I'm finding with Azure, unfortunately, is it's almost scenario by scenario where you have to look at your actual usage personally and figure out what does it make sense for you, right? And there's, I can generalize it and say, yes, we have seen dev and test where there's savings, but I do believe I also have an instance where dev and test are, is more or less break even. So, the answer is yes, but it's almost, you got to run the scenario yourself on your unique circumstances to figure out if it is there.
Okay, perfect. We got a few more questions here, Mike. How can you tell the cost differences between regions, data centers, as you discussed, central US, Eastern, et cetera? Is that available in the calculator, or is it updated as costs change?
It is updated as costs change. And again, the thing with the calculator, one of the things that I would say with the calculator is just use this for just sort of rough budgetary numbers, because if you're in an enterprise agreement, your cost is going to be a little, going to be less than this, and you can obviously negotiate better than this. But yeah, if you just change the from central to East US 2, I don't know if we need to refresh it, but it might be the same. It may be the same price there. But yes, you can go in and just change the, change the data center. If we put it up in Canada, do they? I might have to refresh it. But you can see it, and I do know that I was looking at East versus West the other day, and there is a slight premium in the West data center. So the answer there is yes, but you just need to take a look at it and see what the costs are per region. A lot of them are the same. There are only a couple of data centers that there's premiums on, at least for the VMs. The other thing that I've noticed as well is not all data centers offer all of the options. Some of them only have subsets of the VM sizes and things like that as well. Oh, another question on, have we done similar analysis licensing AWS environments? Yes, the answer there is yes. And so with AWS, unfortunately, with Windows, Microsoft doesn't allow server mobility, so you have to keep SA on it. But the challenge with doing what I'll call a flat-out comparison of AWS to Azure is that they don't charge for the same things. They have different ways of looking at things, or they don't have, you won't find the same number of cores, same number of RAM, same number of storage. So you have to look at it and do a little bit of apples to oranges. But we have done it, and what we are finding is, particularly because AWS has some economics of scale, that their pricing can be cheaper than Azure. The other thing that I would say that we are seeing is that AWS is much more willing to negotiate and do things differently than Microsoft. So for instance, AWS, as we understand it, will do 3-year deals where the bank account, where you do a monetary commit like Microsoft, is for the 3 years, where Microsoft, it's year by year, and you use it after the end of the year. And they're offering bigger discounts for lower commitments from what we're seeing. So we have done it. AWS, we find, typically comes out ahead of Microsoft, by a little bit. With the negotiations, you could do a little bit better than that even. There are some instances where Microsoft comes out ahead, but we have done that as well.
I think that about wraps up the questions, but I was just going to say, Mike, so in about a month's time, we're going to be doing another one of these webinars. But what we're going to be putting something together for is, a lot of our customers struggle with putting together a very quick, ELP, whether they're in an audit situation or just doing a self-assessment internally. And so, Mike, you're going to drop some tips on folks in terms of how to do a quick and dirty, as you call it, ELP, and you're going to give a bit of a sneak peek behind some tools that we've developed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. On the next webinar, we're going to do, how to do a self-assessment, or how to do a true-up, hopefully quicker than you're doing today. So.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I think that just about wraps things up. I'm just going to remind folks that this was recorded, and we will be sending the links out to you. Probably by early next week, you'll have links both to the recording and also to the slide deck if there's any questions at all. feel free to reach out to Mike directly or myself. And we thank you very much for your time, as always. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.